The Sarathi patrol ship tore out of faster-than-light travel just 30 kilometers from the drifting vessel. Before its engines had even finished cooling, weapons batteries were online, boarding tubes extended, and combat teams stood ready. Standard interdiction procedure. Routine, or so everyone believed. The unidentified vessel rotated slowly through the darkness, powerless and silent. A quick database scan returned an immediate match. UIS Karen, a Terran frontier survey ship. Crew complement, 12. Reported missing 8 months earlier by the Terran Frontier Authority after disappearing somewhere between the Helian Reach and the outer edge of Sarathi space. According to every official record, the Chiron had suffered catastrophic drive failure and been swallowed by the endless void, a fate that claimed countless exploration ships as humanity pushed its borders deeper into unmapped space, always expanding faster than supply lines, rescue fleets, or common sense could keep up. To the Sarathi crew, it looked like another abandoned ghost ship. Within minutes, they would discover it was something far worse. High Commander stood at the forward viewport and studied it. It looked exactly like a ship that had been dead for 8 months. No drive signatures, no navigation lights, emergency beacons silent, hull temperature 7 degrees above ambient space. One solar collection array frozen mid-deployment, jutting from the dorsal hull at a useless angle. A loose halo of debris, bolts, insulation foam, a single emergency suit spinning slowly, surrounded the vessel. It looked exactly like a ship that had been dead for 8 months. Ron had been doing this for 16 years. Over 200 vessels boarded, derelicts, surrendering transports, military prizes. He had learned one thing the manuals never adequately conveyed. Dead ships don't feel like anything. This ship felt like it was watching him. One life sign. The sensor officer reported. Human deck 2 stationary. Vitals reading. A pause. Calm. Calm. Velron repeated. Resting heart rate. Sir, normal cortisol as if sleeping. Velron looked at the ship for 3 seconds. Then he ordered the boarding. They went in through the emergency airlock. 12 soldiers in sealed combat armor cutting tools already running. The Chiron's interior was cold enough that breath would have fogged without suits. Emergency lighting painted everything red. Corridors built for humans who found comfort in enclosed spaces. The man was in the cargo bay, sitting cross-legged on the floor, back against equipment crates, hands resting open on his knees in a posture's cultural files, identified absurdly as meditative. He was maybe 50, gray at the temples, an angular face with the weathering that came from years and environments actively trying to kill him. Civilian clothes, no weapons, no armor, no visible communication devices. He opened his eyes when they entered. Ron had reviewed hundreds of hours of human behavior under threat, fear, panic, aggression, defiance. He understood human tells, the way the species registered danger in the set of their shoulders and tension around the eyes. This human had none of them. High Commander, the man said in Sarathi, grammatically flawless with a Velron coastal dialect inflection that hadn't been native to Sarathi homeworlds for 200 years. I've been hoping someone would find me. You took longer than I expected. Moved forward. Identify yourself, Elias Cross. A pause. I used to be Commander Elias Cross of Terran Special Operations Command, but I've been officially dead for 14 years. So, whatever I am now is entirely theoretical. A human spy, a human strategist. There's a difference. Spies collect information. I've been doing something considerably more complicated. Ron crouched to the man's level. He studied the face, the stillness, the absolute absence of fear. What are you doing on this ship? Cross smiled, the smile of someone arriving at a party they'd spent years planning. Waiting, he said, for you specifically. 8 months. I was starting to think I'd have to trigger the beacon myself, trigger the signal. Cross looked at his chest, where a small device was strapped over his sternum, a single LED pulsing green in sync with his heartbeat, keyed to my biometrics. My heart stops. It fires. My heart keeps beating. It stays dormant. Velen stood. He looked at the device for a long moment. What does it signal? Everything, Cross said quietly. Everything I spent 14 years building. The silence in the cargo bay had a particular quality. The silence between a trigger pull and an impact when something irreversible is already in motion. "Kill him," Velron said. The soldiers fired. Elias Cross died on the floor of the UES Karen's cargo bay, in cold red light, with a smile on his face that would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The device on his chest pulsed once, then went dark. Then a signal fired from the Karen's dormant communications array. A compressed burst lasting 0.003 seconds, covering a bandwidth no known civilian system could produce. The signal traveled toward 120 relay points, positioned across 40 light-years of space. On every Sarathi sensor array in the sector, 200 points of light appeared simultaneously. Things that hadn't been there a moment before. Ron stood over the body and looked at his tactical display for a long time without speaking. "What are those contacts?" his sensor officer asked, voice unsteady. He didn't answer. He was reading the forensic medical report that had just arrived. The report's conclusion was brief and impossible. The body's DNA matched a biological construct, a sophisticated replica built from Cross's genetic template with functioning organ systems and genuine vital signs. But it had never been Elias Cross. The indicator light had not triggered because Cross died. It had triggered because Cross chose somewhere in 40 light-years of Sarathi space. Elias Cross was alive. The 1,200 contacts weren't ships. Sarathi Fleet Command established this in the 43 minutes following the Karen incident. The contacts had no drive signatures, no weapons emissions, no hull heat consistent with crewed vessels. They were small, 2 meters across, and completely inert, as if they had simply materialized and stopped. Autonomous communication relays, positioned with inhuman precision, at pre-selected coordinates across 40 light-years of space. The closest sat 90 kilometers off the port bow of the Sarathi carrier, Unbroken Command. The farthest anchored a position deep in the Helian Reach, in a region no Sarathi ship had ever mapped. They had been there for 3 years, running completely cold, cycling their power consumption below the threshold of Sarathi passive detection. When Cross's signal reached them, they woke up. The relay network transmitted to 217 receivers embedded inside Sarathi military facilities. Not near them, not adjacent. Inside, sewn into data routing architecture, hidden in systems that had been installed and certified by Sarathi engineers who had found nothing wrong with them because whoever installed the receivers had also been doing the inspections. The 217 receivers were in 41 fleet command centers, 38 orbital weapon platforms, 19 shipyards, 6 intelligence headquarters, and the personal communication system aboard the Imperial flagship. The message Cross had sent through the buoy network was 8 words in Terran Standard. "Shipard is active. Iron Thread begins. You know what to do." Operation Iron Thread had been running for 14 years. Cross had disappeared during a routine diplomatic mission, so the official record stated the actual record, classified above the Terran Council, stated that Cross had volunteered for a mission with no return date. He crossed the border as a merchant navigator, speaking the Sarathi language at the level of a native regional dialect that no human academy had ever taught. He built an identity 1 layer at a time over 2 years. He spent the next 12 years being someone who had never existed. He recruited carefully, not for courage or even skill. Iron Thread needed people who could disappear completely, people who had grown up in border regions and spoke Sarathi before English, former intelligence officers who had made careers of performance, engineers who could do brilliant technical work while keeping everything they actually were behind a door. The Sarathi would never think to open. He placed them, he watched them advance, he helped where he could, and stayed invisible where he couldn't. Iron Thread's operational concept was simple in theory and extraordinarily complex in practice. Don't infiltrate the Sarathi Empire to steal information. Infiltrate it to change it subtly, slowly in ways that would matter at a specific moment. The 23 ship designers had been the most important piece. Every Sarathi warship commissioned in the past decade had been designed with modifications so small and technically defensible that they had passed every quality inspection. A mass driver port with a barrel geometry that would perform at 97% efficiency under normal conditions and catastrophically jam under the harmonic frequency produced when the ship's own shields were stressed above 85% capacity. Navigation arrays that would drift by a critical 0.3 of a degree when exposed to the electromagnetic interference pattern of Terran electronic warfare suites. Shield harmonics with a resonance gap at one specific angle of incidence. Nothing that would be noticed, everything that would matter. The hidden compartment beneath the Karen's cargo bay floor measured exactly large enough for one person. Cross had lain down in it 8 months ago, put himself into induced metabolic suspension, and waited for a Sarathi patrol to find what looked like a dead informant. The decoy's death had woken him up. He was, as of 37 minutes ago, fully conscious, fully equipped, and moving toward the Chiron secondary airlock with a mission profile he had been running in his head for 3 years. He was also technically 4.22 light-years inside Sarathi territorial space, with no extraction assets and no cover identity that hadn't just been burned. Cross considered this for approximately 4 seconds. Then he opened the airlock and went to work. In a sector 40 light-years away, a Sarathi orbital weapons platform received a maintenance directive reclassifying its primary targeting system as offline for calibration, removing it from the tactical equation without a single shot fired. At Sarathi Shipyard Complex 7, the facility director initiated an emergency evacuation drill that left 32 half-finished warships without enough personnel to bring a single system online. In 3 separate fleet groups, 17 warships began receiving course corrections through authenticated command channels, directing them toward coordinates that happened to sit in the geometric center of something those fleet commanders couldn't see yet. Iron Thread was moving, and Velron, standing on the bridge of his flagship, pulled up the design manifest of his own ship and began running background checks on every engineer in the file. The Shepherd fleet came out of the Rogue Star system in a formation line that took 11 minutes to fully emerge. 800 warships, not the newest hulls in the Terran inventory. Newer ships had better profiles for conventional engagement, and this mission hadn't been designed for convention. The Shepherd fleet had been selected for one quality that no requisition form had ever listed. Its crews had been briefed on Iron Thread, cleared to a classification level above the Terran Council, and had spent 3 years in a system with no external communication links, doing nothing but training, maintaining, and waiting. They were, by any reasonable measure, the most bored fleet in the history of human military service. They were also absolutely ready. Fleet Admiral Sarah Vance stood at the forward command display and watched her ships form up. She had commanded the Shepherd fleet since its inception, read into the full picture of Iron Thread on the day Cross had disappeared into Sarathi space, and had spent 3 years maintaining the discipline to keep 800 ships sitting silent while the rest of the war played out in other people's headlines. She transmitted a single tightly focused pulse on 37 specific frequencies. The frequencies Iron Thread agents had been briefed at various points across 14 years to monitor. The message was 2 words: Sefard Rising. In 90 seconds following that broadcast, 17 Sarathi warships in 3 different fleet groups received navigation course corrections from their command networks. Corrections that came through authenticated channels signed with valid officer credentials. 14 accepted the corrections and changed course before their bridge crews could override. In a single Sarathi sector, 3 orbital platforms received simultaneous maintenance directives that removed their targeting capability. At 5 different shipyard facilities, Iron Thread agents executed quiet administrative decisions that would cost the Sarathi weeks of recovery. It wasn't elegant. Parts of it were improvised in the moment. Cross had planned it that way. He understood from the beginning that 217 people couldn't execute a perfectly choreographed plan across 40 light-years of space. What they could do was apply pressure at every available point simultaneously and let the collective effect become chaos. Sarathi Military Command received 740 separate high-priority incident reports in the first 40 minutes. They could not have adequately responded to 40, but 8 of Cross's agents were captured before they could act. Velron's discovery of the impossible personnel file had reached fleet commanders with enough lead time. That 6 agents were caught mid-operation, their cover identities unraveling under direct security scrutiny that went deeper than anything they had prepared for. 2 more were identified through a cross-reference analysis matching similar file anomalies at other installations. The 8 were transported to HFY, a SARI deep space detention facility, specifically because it sat outside Shepard Fleet Emergence footprint. The facility commander had a reputation for thorough interrogation. Cross received the capture report 26 minutes after it happened. He sat with it for a long time. The operational calculus was straightforward. Iron Thread had 217 agents. 8 captured represented a 3.7% loss, acceptable for an operation of this scale. The mission could continue without them. Going after them would require Cross to penetrate a military detention facility with no support assets, burn his remaining operational security, and potentially compromise the people he was trying to rescue. The right call was to let them go. Cross had made a lot of right calls in 14 years. Most of them had kept people alive. He changed course for HFY. It wasn't an emotional decision, or not entirely. The 8 captured agents knew the Iron Thread network. They knew assets, positions, the relay architecture, the identities of people who hadn't been caught. The interrogation facility had a 3-hour head start. 3 hours was not enough to break people who had been doing this for years. 6 hours might be. He had 4. HFY was a small installation, fuel depot, communication relay, 1 detention block attached as an afterthought. The security was not exceptional. Cross had spent a month studying it 3 years ago as a contingency. He found, approaching it now, that his memory was perfect. He went in through the facility's waste heat exchange system, where a security camera had a 40-degree coverage gap, a gap created by a technician who had made a mistake in placement, reviewed by a facility administrator who had certified it as acceptable. The administrator had been an Iron Thread asset. The gap had been deliberate. Cross had not known about it. He hadn't planned for it. He found it because it was the kind of thing Iron Thread agents did. Small, quiet, technically defensible acts that created options for futures they might not live to use. He moved through the facility in 27 minutes without triggering a single alarm. He found 7 of his 8 agents in cells 3 through 9, physically intact, psychologically present, aware enough to recognize his face, and not make the mistake of reacting visibly. Then he found the 8th cell. The prisoner inside was not one of his agents. She was a woman in her 60s, lean, hard, sitting in the specific way that people learn to sit when they have spent years making themselves comfortable in confined spaces. She had a scar running from her left ear to her jaw that Cross had last seen in a mission debrief photograph taken 22 years ago. He stood at the cell door for 4 seconds. "General Santos," he said. She looked at him with the expression of someone whose estimation of an entire situation had just been revised. "Cross," she said, "I heard you were dead. I heard the same about you." She held his gaze for another moment. "How long before the shift rotation?" 19 minutes. "Good." She rose from the bunk with the ease of someone who had been waiting a long time to stand. "Then I have time to tell you the one thing I've been trying to get out of this facility for 22 years. Cross waited. "The Emperor knows about Iron Thread. Santos said he's known since year 2, and he hasn't shut it down." Cross processed this for exactly 3 seconds. "Why?" he said. Santos met his eyes. "Because he needed it," she said. "Not for the reason you think." They moved quickly through the facility while Santos talked, and Cross listened in the way he had learned to listen over 14 years, filing and cross-referencing while the rest of him navigated corridors, timed guard rotations, and calculated that they had 11 minutes before the triggered alarm became an active search. Santos had been captured 22 years ago on an operation she had never told anyone about, because the people she would have told were the people she was investigating. She had found an anomaly in the war's opening engagements. The specific sequence of diplomatic failures and military provocations that had turned a territorial dispute into the largest conflict the sector had seen in 3 centuries. The anomaly was small, a series of communication intercepts showing that both the Terran Council's hawkish faction and the Sarathi Emperor's War Council had received intelligence assessments that were factually accurate in their details, but systematically wrong in their strategic implications, not fabricated, selectively curated. The intelligence was real. The picture it painted was false. Someone had been choosing with great care which real facts each side saw, creating the kind of misunderstanding that doesn't get corrected because both sides are acting on accurate information and can't understand why the other keeps behaving irrationally. Santos had followed the curation back to its source. The Sarathi had won 7 major engagements in the war's first 12 years, 7 victories that had cemented the Dominion's strategic confidence and encouraged escalation from frontier dispute to full military campaign. 7 victories against positions Terran Command had considered defensible with adequate reinforcement. Every position had been quietly abandoned before the attack. Not on record, but the reinforcements had been delayed, diverted, held up by logistics decisions made by officers 2 levels above the local commanders, for reasons that were each individually defensible. 7 positions abandoned in place through 1,000 small decisions that individually meant nothing. 3 of the officers responsible for those decisions had since died in accidents. 4 had been promoted to positions where their access to strategic intelligence was extensive and their ability to quietly redirect things was essentially unchecked. Santos had spent 22 years inside a detention cell tracing the provenance of those decisions back to their origin point. The intelligence that had shaped both sides toward war had come from the same source as the logistical diversions. Not a human, not a Sarathi, something that had been present in both command structures for decades, operating with the patience of something that measured time on a very different scale. Santos had found the name in an ancient Sarathi archive in records so old that most Sarathi scholars had classified them as mythological. The Velon, a collective entity, not a species in the conventional sense, but an organizational consciousness distributed across multiple biological substrates. Individual units functioned independently. The collective processed as a single intelligence extended across all of them. The Sarathi's ancient records described a period 800 years ago called the Silencing, a rapid contraction in which dozens of worlds went dark in quick succession. Fleets dispatched to investigate and not returning, communication links dropping and never being re-established. The Sarathi Empire had contracted to less than a third of its former size in 40 years. The official history attributed this to internal rebellions and natural disasters. Santos believed something had come through and eaten the outer territories and left on a cycle with the intention of returning. The next interval, Santos said as they reached the facility's secondary airlock, is not in 50 years. The Emperor's archivists calculated it differently than I did. My estimate was 3 years from now. His estimate is already crossed the airlock open already. The villain responded to your buoy network activation. That signal pattern 1 to 200 points of light in that specific geometric arrangement. It matches the ancient Sarathi warning beacon pattern from before the silencing. She stepped through into the dark. You accidentally told them someone down here remembered what happened last time. They heard it, Cross said. They heard it, and they changed their schedule. She held his gaze in the dark. Cross, they're already here. 10,000 ships, 40 light years behind you, moving at speed. The Emperor has known for 6 months. He's been trying to create the conditions for both sides to know what's coming without the Vel's agents in both our governments seeing it. Before he could move, Santos pressed a data chip into his hand. The Emperor had placed it in her cell 6 years ago through a guard who hadn't known what they were carrying. It contained everything: 22 years of intelligence, 4 names of embedded Velon agents in Terran Command, documentation thorough enough that a military tribunal wouldn't need a full hearing. He's been waiting, Santos said, for someone to get close enough to deliver it and for a communication pathway that couldn't read. Cross looked at the chip for one moment. Then he pulled up the relay network and composed the most important message he had sent in 14 years. 2 hours later, on the bridge of his flagship, High Commander Ran received an all-channels broadcast originating from the Imperial Palace that he had not been told to expect. The Emperor of the Sarathi Dominion, sat alone before a camera in what appeared to be a private study. He was not wearing ceremonial dress. There was no throne, no attendants, no symbols of office. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally arrived at the place where he could set it down. "The war between our peoples ends now," Emperor Sarah said. "We have a greater problem than each other." Emperor Sarah spoke for 11 minutes. He did not speak like a head of state making a tactical decision. He spoke like a man who had carried a secret for too long and had finally found the right moment to lay it down. The broadcast went out on every channel simultaneously, civilian and military, Sarah and human encrypted command frequencies and open public networks. No attempt at deniability, no official protocols, just a figure at a desk choosing to tell the truth at whatever cost that required. The Vel were real. They had been real for at least 1,200 years. The historical record went further back than the silencing if you knew where to look. The silencing itself had not been destruction in the conventional sense. The realm didn't obliterate civilizations. They absorbed them. Biological and digital consciousness assimilated into the collective, which processed the acquired knowledge and capability before moving on. The Sarathi worlds that had gone dark 800 years ago had not been destroyed. They had been converted. The Vel operated on a cycle because absorption required time. They came through, took what they could integrate, and retreated to process the acquisition before returning. 800 years was how long it took to fully integrate 40 worlds. They were due back. They had planned to return to a sector occupied by 2 civilizations in the middle of a war of attrition. Population stressed, military infrastructure damaged, decision-making impaired by the specific cognitive effects of prolonged conflict, optimal conditions for assimilation. The Vel agents embedded in both command structures had been creating those conditions deliberately for 30 years. The war had never been about territory. It had been about softening both sides for something larger. "I have known this for 16 years, the Emperor said. "I was unable to act without alerting the agents in my own court, who would have accelerated the timeline. I have therefore done the only thing available to me. I maintained the conditions under which Commander Cross's operation could run, because Iron Thread represented the only communication pathway the Velm could not monitor." He looked directly at the camera. "The 4 human officers who have been shaping Terran's strategic decisions since the war's 3rd year are listed in the file I am transmitting with this broadcast. I trust that someone on the human side will deal with them efficiently." He paused. "The Velm fleet has entered the sector. I could not prevent their arrival. I lack the capability to act without their agents seeing it coming. What I have done is ensure that both our civilizations have at this moment the maximum possible military assets available, which required the war to not achieve decisive results on either side, which I recognize has cost an enormous number of lives and for which I accept full responsibility." The broadcast ended. Fleet Admiral Vance watched it 3 times on the flag bridge of the Shepherd's lead vessel. Then she pulled up the Emperor's attached file, saw the 4 names, recognized 2 of them, and transmitted the file to Terran Defense Command with a 3-word cover message: "Arrest them now." Then Cross came over the command channel, 2 light-years out in a stolen Sarathi courier ship, closing at maximum speed. "Don't run the conventional numbers," Cross said. 1,400 of us against 10,000 of them doesn't work. We're not going to fight them conventionally." "How are we fighting them?" Vance asked. "The same way I got here," Cross said, with patience and the right architecture. The Vel were a collective intelligence, a single consciousness distributed across 10,000 physical platforms. They operated through continuous coordination, every unit receiving and processing the collective signal constantly. It was what made them lethal. No individual decision latency, no chain of command delays, no confusion about priorities. It was also an architectural weakness. Santos had confirmed it from Sarathi historical records. The silencing had left one specific reference to what the Velm looked like at the edge of their operational range. When the collective signal started to fragment, individual units became confused. They stopped coordinating. They made individual decisions which they had never been designed to make. They collided. They fired on each other. "You fragment the collective signal," Vance said slowly. by flooding the operational area with enough distinct, simultaneous independent signal sources that the collective can't distinguish its own coordination stream from the noise. "They are processing 10,000 concurrent streams already," Cross said. "Add another 2,000 independent sources on conflicting frequencies, and the processing load exceeds what the collective can sustain." Vance looked at the relay buoys on her display, 200 of them already active. The Emperor had agreed to activate the Sarathi beacon network, another 400 nodes across the sector. Every ship in Shepard fleet had 800 communication arrays. Every active Sarathi warship added 600 more. The Sarathi records say the collective begins to fracture at 600 simultaneous independent sources. Cross said at 800, fragmentation becomes irreversible. Vance ran the numbers. "We have over 2,000. She said yes. We'd be broadcasting across every frequency, including our own tactical channels. Yes, we'd be completely communications blind for the duration. Yes, Cross said, which is why every ship needs to know exactly what to do before we start, because once the broadcasting begins, we won't be able to tell them." They had 6 hours. It was exactly enough time. They had 11 hours. Cross reached the Shepard fleet in 6. The conversation between him, Admiral Vance, and Emperor Sarah lasted 40 minutes and produced a plan that everyone involved recognized as having approximately a 40% chance of working under the most optimistic assumptions. It was the best plan available. The orders went out from Shepard Fleet Command to every ship. At hours 10 minutes, all active tactical communication to cease. At H hour, every ship's communication array would begin broadcasting simultaneously on individually assigned frequencies in the non-tactical spectrum. Maximum power independent of every other ship on a cycle pattern designed to produce the maximum possible signal variety. No two ships broadcasting the same pattern. No coordination of broadcast content. The point was not to transmit useful information. The point was to exist as distinct non-coordinating sources, to be in aggregate the computational equivalent of 2,000 people, all talking at once, in a room where a single voice needed to be heard. The Emperor's order to the Sarathi beacon network went out simultaneously. 417 nodes across the sector came online for the first time in 800 years. When the signal deployment began, it was visible on the electromagnetic spectrum displays as a wall of light. The VEL were 11 minutes from New Providence's orbital defense range when it hit them. 2014 distinct simultaneous non-coordinating electromagnetic sources erupting across the operational area at once. The signal patterns were genuinely random, generated independently by each ship and node. The collective intelligence's processing could not identify them as a coordinated attack. It experienced them the way a human nervous system would experience every sensory input maximizing simultaneously, not as a threat to analyze, but as a breakdown of the systems doing the analyzing. The first sign was a course deviation in the VEL fleet lead elements, small, not aggressive, the kind of variance that happens when a steering correction isn't made. Then a second. In 90 seconds, the VEL fleet coherent formation dissolved. Not in a militarily useful way, not immediately. The individual ships didn't turn on each other right away, and they didn't stop, but they stopped moving together. The tight, coordinated advance toward New Providence fragmented into thousands of separate headings, individual vessels operating on whatever the last uncorrupted instruction their substrate had been running. When the collective started to break down, some stopped, some turned back. 47 collided with other Velm vessels, executing incompatible maneuvers. Not violently at their current speeds, but enough to disable both vessels in each collision. Some turned on each other, not all of them. Some individual units found coherence faster than others. The Shepard fleet engaged those, and the Sarathi fleet engaged those. And it was a battle in the technical sense, but not the conventional sense. Individual VAL ships making individual decisions for the first time in their existence, discovering what they were when the collective wasn't telling them. Most of them weren't fighters without the collective. Most of them were simply confused. It took 4 hours and 17 minutes for the VEL fleet to cease to function as a military force. Most fled, dispersing in every direction, the remnants of the collective finding enough coherence for one unified decision. This place is dangerous. New Providence was intact. Cross watched the last of the Velm fleet coherent signals disperse. The messages waiting for him were extensive. Vance's battle report. The Sarathi armistice proposal filed with Shepard Fleet Command within 20 minutes of the Vel retreat, not through formal diplomatic channels, but a commander-to-commander communication that the Emperor had pre-authorized, noting that a war manufactured by a third party to serve that party's interests was not a war either side had chosen to fight, and that continuing it would be, in his specific phrasing, idiotic. The 4 Terran Council officers had been arrested. Santos was giving a 3-hour debrief that showed no signs of ending. Surrounded by intelligence officers who had the expressions of people receiving the most significant briefing of their careers, Cross sat alone in the courier ship and let himself be tired for the first time in 14 years. He thought about the 217 people who had built Iron Thread with him, one embedded identity at a time across a decade and a half of being someone else. He thought about the people who hadn't come back. He thought about the 4,000 humans who had died in the 7 battles the Vel had engineered. He thought about the Sarathi deaths, a number that existed somewhere in the Emperor's records and deserved to be added to the same accounting. He was very tired. The signal came in 17 minutes after the last Vel beacon vanished from tracking range. It arrived on a human carrier frequency that no ship in the sector was broadcasting on, directional originating from a point 40 light-years beyond the operational boundary, the exact direction of the Vel retreat. One word in English, remember. Cross stared at it for a long time. The Velon were a collective that had never communicated in the language of a species it hadn't yet absorbed. There had been no human units assimilated. There should have been no human language available to them. But the Sarathi records from before the silencing contained a brief reference that no subsequent scholar had focused on. Sarathi explorers in the century before the silencing had encountered ruins at the outer edge of the sector. Human ruins ancient beyond any known colony pattern, thousands of years old when the Sarathi found them, matching no civilization in any recorded history. The Sarathi had catalogued them and moved on. The ruins had been in the silencing's path. The Vel had passed through them. They had found something in ruins that no living human had built and carried it for 800 years in the collective's vast distributed memory, waiting for a moment that language could be used. Cross looked at the word for a long time. He thought about an ancient human civilization that had been in this sector long before humanity's recorded history. He thought about whether they had encountered the Velm, and what they had wanted something, anything, to remember about them. He thought about whether the word was a warning, a greeting, or a message from something absorbed and not quite gone. He opened a channel to Admiral Vance. "Signal received," he said. "Log it. Highest classification. Don't bury it. I want it preserved, not classified into oblivion. The Vel will come back, not on a cycle this time. They're operating on instinct now, without coordination, without their plan, which means they'll be driven by something more fundamental than strategy." "What's that?" Vance asked. "The same thing that makes everything dangerous," Cross said. "Hunger." He looked at the word one final time. Then he closed the channel, pulled up a blank operations document, and started thinking. For the first time in 14 years, he wasn't making a plan to die. He was making one to live, and to make sure that the next thing humanity built in the dark was something that, when found, would give the same message back. Not a warning, not a plea, a promise. They were here. They were building. They would not forget.